Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Johnny Dio, a name that once echoed through the streets of New York's labor and business worlds. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Now, settle in and let the story of Johnny Dio guide you into the night. He came from tenement blocks where stairwells smelled of laundry steam and boiling coffee, where families from the old country lived stacked one upon another. Born in 1914 and baptized John Dio, he grew up hearing two kinds of sermons, one in church about virtue and one on the corner about hustle. The boys on his block learned quick math from dice and geography from delivery routes. He watched who walked proud, who kept their heads down, who held keys to the back doors that really mattered. Police blotters kept his name early. Petty arrests taught him court's rhythms, bondsman's numbers, and the limits of fear. He understood that a loud punch draws attention, while a quiet favor compounds interest. Time in custody hardened his patience. He learned to wait, learned to smile, learned to never write what a whisper could carry. Older men noticed the kid with a steady gaze. They called him Johnny. Not a showy bruiser, not a barroom shouter. He listened more than he spoke. In a town that prized muscle, he prized leverage. The garment district blocks of factories, cutting rooms, patterned tables became his classroom. Roll-up gates clanged open before dawn. Trucks queued, foremen yelled, and deadlines ruled. Around those loading docks, labor wasn't just muscle, it was bargaining power, votes at union halls, signatures on contracts. He saw the gap between what workers feared and what bosses dreaded, and he found his angle in that space. Money moved when deliveries flowed on time. Money froze when deliveries stalled. With that truth, a world opened. During the 1,930 seconds and into the 1,940 seconds, he attached himself to crews whose names rarely appeared in print unless someone was in handcuffs. But far from flashy rackets, he cultivated a niche that promised steadier profits: labor and trucking. Employers wanted peace. Workers wanted dignity and steady pay. He inserted himself as the fixer, the broker who could give bosses sleep and keep crews in line. Phone calls set meetings in luncheonettes or back booths in hotel bars. He kept notes in his head, not on paper. If a shop wanted a contract signed without chaos, he had a union official to recommend. If a strike brewed, he knew which steward to reach. Out of this brokerage came dues, fees, and envelopes, always the cost of quiet. He graduated from street brawls to conference rooms, where coats draped over chairs and ashtrays filled slowly, while everyone talked about everything except the real deal. He developed what insiders later called paper locals unions with charters and officers but few genuine members. In a legal sense, these entities existed. In a practical sense, they offered leverage, votes at conventions, bargaining rights, clout to sway decisions. They gave him seats at tables he had no business sitting at, unless power itself served as a passport. For dress manufacturers, he could deliver signatures on labor agreements. For those who challenged him, he could present hurdles that ate days and dollars. He didn't need to yell. He only needed to remind people what delays could cost. By mid-century, his reputation was strong enough to draw figures at the top of national labor politics. One of them was Jimmy Hoffa, the meteoric Teamsters organizer rising behind a troubled president, Dave Beck. Hoffa wanted delegates and votes to consolidate control. New York, with its cargo, fleets, and union density, mattered enormously. Here, Johnny's network of charters and connections offered a fast lane. He understood the arithmetic. A stack of local charters, even small, meant more hands raised at a convention. That arithmetic angered reformers and delighted men who valued outcomes over procedures. Between them, quiet understandings formed. Papers were filed. Appeals were made. New locals appeared in name, ready to be counted. And the alliances behind them thickened. Journalists chased this story. Among them, labor columnist Victor Riesel wrote sharply about the garment district, the trucking corridors, and the men in the shadows who profited from both. He named names. He spotlighted paper locals and the ways sham organizations twisted elections and contracts. Riesel's readers included prosecutors, legislators, and union members tired of being pawns. His columns turned private complaints into public questions. Who really ran these locals? Who took the fees? Who made the threats? By mid-1950 seconds, pressure mounted. State and federal investigators mapped relationships from New York to Washington. Hearings loomed. Subpoenas traveled from court clerks to doormen to corner candy stores. The air felt different. The old quiet no longer held. Then that April in 1956, the late-night attack on Riesel shook the city. The assault blinded him, yet he refused to retreat, dictating columns from a hospital bed. The investigation moved at full tilt. The police pursued the thrower, a young street tough named Abraham Telvey, and a string of go-betweens who had handled money and orders. As names fell into custody, rumors converged on the familiar figure behind the curtain. Prosecutors publicly described a conspiracy to silence a critic by outsourcing a vicious act, a chilling message to anyone covering labor corruption. In newsrooms, the working theory said the attack was meant to stop Riesel's reporting on racketeers who fed off the garment trade and trucking unions. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or both, witnesses wavered. Affidavits were signed, then recanted. Leads opened, then died. The case showed how hard it was to pierce circles where silence was a survival strategy. The state indicted Johnny Dio for conspiracy in the Riesel case. He maintained his innocence. Legal teams filed motions. Evidence arrived, tangled by hearsay and reluctant testimony. In court, under the glare of reporters' flashbulbs, he presented the same calm that had carried him through years of quiet deals. He smiled slightly, answered little, and leaned on the Constitution when needed. Eventually, prosecutors failed to clinch a conviction on that conspiracy. That outcome did not end his legal troubles. It only opened more fronts. With public outrage high and congressional spotlights sweeping the union world, officials brought broader charges tied to extortion, coercion, and manipulation of union offices. The narrative they presented was blunt. He ran a labor racket machine that demanded tribute from manufacturers and stifled dissent inside locals that he controlled through proxies and threats. He became a star witness of sorts, not for what he said, but for how stubbornly he refused to say it. The Senate's McClellan Committee, with counsel Robert F. Kennedy, dragged the world of labor racketeering into daytime television. Millions watched as witnesses invoked the Fifth Amendment again and again. Johnny's turn drew close attention. He sat steady, repeating constitutional protections as questions flew about paper locals, trucking contracts, dress factories, and his ties to Hoffa. The scene was theater, but the stakes were real. Those hearings generated leads for prosecutors coast to coast. Afterward, grand juries in New York targeted him for perjury and other crimes tied to labor intimidation and financial misconduct. The new cases didn't hinge on the Riesel attack. They focused on how he wielded influence in unions and how money moved through that system. One set of charges accused him of extorting garment manufacturers who paid to guarantee labor peace. Another emphasized perjury false statements under oath about his roles and relationships in the union world. Tax investigators joined in, alleging he had hidden income and skimmed funds through fronts and no-show jobs. Piece by piece, outcomes accumulated. He faced convictions on perjury counts, drawing time behind bars. He endured acquittals on some extortion charges and mistrials on others. It became a pattern, an arrest, a press conference, a courtroom fight, a measured statement from his lawyers, and then months of quiet back and forth until a verdict arrived. Even when a jury cleared him on a high-profile count, other indictments waited. Behind the headlines, the garment district kept humming. Freight elevators creaked, decade-old sewing machines clattered, schedule boards flipped from rush to urgent to impossible. Yet the balance of power shifted. After the Riesel outrage, business owners felt bolder calling investigators. Reformers inside unions pushed for clean elections and transparent books. State officials tightened oversight of welfare funds and pension plans. The Teamsters' internal storm intensified, with leaders battling over legitimacy and alliances. Here, too, Johnny's name appeared linked to unauthorized locals, irregular charters, and a vote-padding scheme that embarrassed national figures. He wasn't the only player, but he personified a method. Use paperwork as a weapon. Combine the hint of force with promises of stability. Collect fees for removing problems you created. Public disgust made that playbook harder to run. By the end of the 1,950 seconds, he had become the city's shorthand for labor racketeering, the man behind the curtain, the architect of paper empires. He had tasted victory in courtrooms and defeat in others. He had dodged the most explosive conspiracy, but took a beating from perjury findings and related counts that forced him to trade tailored suits for prison khaki. Still, his legend survived. To some, he remained the mastermind who could not be cornered. To others, he looked like a symbol of a fading era, cornered by television cameras, grand juries, and a public that had lost its patience. He emerged from each sentence with the same small smile, the same quiet ties to old friends, and the same talent for building influence from fragments. What he built didn't vanish. The garment district would always be vulnerable to people who understood how deadlines distort judgment. Truck routes remain valuable to those who can turn a delay into profit. But the rules had changed. Investigations were faster. Paperwork left trails. Informants found safe harbors. Though he kept his circle tight, the ground under him felt less steady. He had spent 2 decades thriving on silence. Now, everyone talked. He had profited from ambiguity. Now hearings defined terms and outlawed tricks that once passed as savvy. He had once decided who worked and who watched. Now he was the one being watched, day and night, by men with notebooks, badges, and a mandate to make an example of him. Even with that scrutiny, he still found ways to maneuver. He maintained links to factories, warehouses, and distribution firms through associates who owed him favors. He nurtured loyalties inside certain locals and company offices, even after official bans. He stretched his reach beyond dresses and trucks into related trades, where delivery timetables and picket lines still meant leverage. Court supervision couldn't erase a reputation that had taken years to build. But each move drew fresh attention. A minor complaint could now trigger a statewide inquiry. A routine contract negotiation could turn into an indictment for coercion. The margin for error shrank, until even small missteps required weeks of legal cleanup. He adapted, but the game no longer favored the quiet broker, with a handful of sealed deals in his pocket. That is how he stood at the turn of a new decade. Famous, watched, hardened by prison, yet unbroken in the conviction that order could be bought and sold if one controlled the choke points where work meets deadline. He had risen from a tenement stairwell to the front pages by mastering unions, trucks, and timing. He had earned enemies who preferred the honest mess of democracy over a tidy fix. He had inspired fear in men who remembered how easily a promised delay could become a ruinous week. He had also drawn the attention of lawmakers determined to prove that wage earners and employers could settle terms without paying tribute to middlemen with clenched smiles. The stage was set for the next battles of his life, where old habits met new laws, and where a once invisible broker learned what it meant to live permanently under the lamp he had always avoided. The whispers didn't fade with time. They multiplied. A sedan idled across from a midtown lunch counter where he liked the egg salad. A man with a notebook pretended to read the sports page while watching the door. Telephones clicked in offices where investigators waited for a voice they could pin to a crime. In a city that moved too fast to notice anything twice, the one thing nobody missed now was him. Friends spoke softer around payphones. Strangers seemed to know his face. When he stepped off a curb, he felt the pause in traffic that comes when everyone wants to see who crosses first. Yet he carried himself as if he'd ordered this attention, as if every glance were a bill he had already paid. He knew how to work under pressure. The tenement training that taught him patience also taught him to love a puzzle, especially one with moving pieces. After the hearings on union corruption filled afternoon television and turned names like his into family room talk, he kept the same rhythm. Meals at the same places, visits to factories that still depended on quick shipments, conversations that revealed nothing. What changed was the company he kept. Some associates put distance between their shops and his calls. Others leaned in, deciding that if he could survive that storm, he could help them survive anything. Those men swore by his efficiency. They liked that he solved problems without shouting, and that he treated favors like investments, not gifts. Behind the storefronts and showrooms, He was tied to a larger structure that gave his quiet style a steel backbone. He moved within the orbit of the Lucchese family, the crew that had seeded itself into trucking, garment hauling, and union halls long before his rise. He knew Thomas Lucchese, whose calm guidance made a certain kind of stability possible. And he worked alongside men like Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, who specialized in making trouble slip off the record. Inside that network, he excelled at an assignment few could handle. Turn paperwork into power, turn scheduling into profit, and keep heat away from the men at the top. He was not a street enforcer. He was the broker who could make a phone call that cost a factory more than a broken window ever could. Federal law caught up to the old tricks. The 1959 labor reform statute barred felons from holding union office for years after conviction, and it required reporting that used to be optional. For a man who'd built a career on gray areas, the new rules cut paths through the fog. He had already taken a hit on perjury, lying about associations and roles during an inquiry into labor manipulation, and he did time for it. When he emerged, the ban on holding office meant he needed intermediaries if he wanted to keep influence over contracts and locals. So he adapted. He put trusted allies forward as officers, coached them on what to sign and what to stall, and kept his own name off documents as if ink carried its own kind of handcuffs. He had always preferred leverage over noise, so the switch suited him. He still handled garment center tensions that could ruin a season if a shipment didn't land on time. He still used charters and bylaws like tools. The shell locals he had built in earlier years, empty unions with charters and officers, but few actual workers remained part of the landscape. Investigators had stripped many of those charters, but not all. More importantly, the habit those charters created inside the industry, a habit of checking with him when votes mattered, outlived the paperwork. Employers fearful of a sudden picket line, union men eager for advancement, and politicians who counted every ballot still found their way to his table. His tie to Jimmy Hoffa stood as the loudest example of how that system worked. Hoffa wanted strength inside the Teamsters' national structure. Dio had the ability to deliver delegates, even if the rank-and-file footprint was thin. Years later, probes concluded that those sham locals bolstered Hoffa's totals during crucial showdowns. On that point, critics fumed and allies shrugged. What mattered in the moment was arithmetic. When the votes were counted, the alliance had done its job. Hoffa advanced. The price came due when Senate investigators and prosecutors mapped every step that made those tallies possible and found his fingerprint on the gears. The perjury conviction clung like a shadow. Courts have no patience for false statements under oath, and the finding marked him as a man officially untrustworthy, not just a tough negotiator. That label helped prosecutors in later cases. When they brought extortion charges tied to garment manufacturers, they argued a simple line: pay for calm or suffer chaos. Some juries believed it, others didn't. But the pattern of accusations piled up. Owners described calls about labor peace, reminders that traffic on a loading dock could move at a crawl, messages that problems could vanish for a fee. He denied wrongdoing, said he promoted order in a rough trade, and let his lawyers puncture weaknesses in testimony. It worked sometimes. It failed other times. The track record became a ledger with acquittals on one side and convictions on the other. One set of federal cases in the 1,960 seconds targeted a different craft. Rather than shaking down a thriving plant, he stood accused of handling what investigators called bust-outs, a term born in warehouses where goods disappeared to trucks that left no paper trail. The scheme ran like this: take control of a small manufacturer or distributor, pad books with inflated inventories, order product on credit using the improved figures, divert that product to buyers who paid cash, leave vendors empty-handed, then drop the company into bankruptcy. The ruin fell on suppliers, not the brokers who orchestrated the collapse. In the garment trades and related lines, it was a quiet catastrophe, no loud fights, just unpaid invoices and shuttered doors. According to court records, he played a central role in planning and protecting those collapses, using his labor influence to distract auditors and keep drivers compliant. In those cases, juries convicted him on counts that included bankruptcy, fraud, and conspiracy. Appeals trimmed here and there, but the core verdicts held, and he went away for a solid stretch. Prison didn't change his outlook so much as it changed his schedule. He read case law like a man planning a chess match with the Warden's calendar. He learned which filings paused sentences, which brought him back to town for hearings, which gave his lawyers a foothold to challenge evidence. He treated time as another kind of negotiation. Meanwhile, life outside kept moving. Factories adjusted to new oversight. Union reformers used federal filing requirements to pry open old offices and check the books. The Teamsters weathered their own storms, as Hoffa fought his battles with prosecutors. Inside that swirl, his legend grew in a paradoxical way. The more he was locked up, the more people told stories about how he used to run things. By the time he returned, the stories had tightened into a myth that worked for him as much as it worked against him. His legal fights stretched across jurisdictions. State and federal grand juries took turns. A local district attorney in Manhattan built cases with garment owners who finally felt safe speaking. Federal prosecutors in the southern and eastern districts threaded mail fraud and bankruptcy statutes through shipments and invoices. The Internal Revenue Service examined whether the envelopes that moved through coffee shops and coat rooms ever reached a tax return. When they found gaps, they filed charges. Not every allegation stuck. Some witnesses recanted. Others forgot details at crucial moments. But enough counts survived that he cycled through court dates like a man with too many calendars pinned to his kitchen wall. He learned to expect that cameras would catch him stepping into courthouses. He dressed carefully, never sloppy, as if to tell the world that the man facing charges was still in control. Asked questions by reporters, he offered compliments about the weather, or said nothing at all. Inside, his strategy was consistent. He acknowledged relationships with union men, admitted meetings with manufacturers, then said those contacts were ordinary business in a city that needs deals to run. He let prosecutors frame the story as coercion and tried to reframe it as mediation. When a complaint described a threat, his side called it a reminder about deadlines. When a ledger showed a suspicious payment, his side called it a consultation fee. The tug-of-war played out case after case. The mid-1960s convictions on bankruptcy-related counts landed hardest. They undercut the argument that he was simply a peacemaker between labor and management. Those verdicts said he helped loot companies and wreck creditors by design. It put him in a federal pen long enough that younger organizers and racketeers filled the spaces he used to command. He stayed informed. Relatives and old allies kept him updated on which locals were strong and which factories needed a nudge. He created small legal fires when he could, filings that required a personal appearance back in New York. Each return reminded him how fast the city changes and how stubbornly some corners hold still. While he served time, other names carried the headlines. Robert F. Kennedy moved from Senate counsel to the Justice Department and pursued Hoffa until a jury returned the decisions he wanted. The garment center shifted as production bled to cheaper states and offshore shops. Container shipping altered trucking routes, dulling some of the choke points that once made his calls so powerful. Yet even with these changes, the old math didn't disappear. A truck stuck at the wrong ramp still cost real money. A credible word from the right foreman still prevented headaches. When he came home, he found less room to maneuver, but not a complete desert. There were new constraints. After felony records lengthened, federal law barred him longer from union office. Consent decrees and monitors watched some locals. Employers used private guards and legal counsel before problems grew. And the press no longer needed a big explosion to fill a column. Routine hearings drew news vans. That meant he had to run his playbook with even more distance. He relied on layers: an associate who knew a steward who knew a driver who knew which truck queued first. The distance made him safer but less effective. More could go wrong along the chain, and rival brokers tried to poach his clients by promising faster results. He also dealt with a permanent suspicion that followed him into rooms where once he would have been greeted with relief. Men who might have hired him as a fixer in the past now asked whether hiring him would bring the very heat they hoped to avoid. He countered with results. A contract signed on time, a postponed slowdown, a quiet negotiation that kept a cutting room humming. He priced those outcomes carefully, never cheap, but not so high that a customer balked. He always preferred recurring arrangements to one-offs. A steady stream of small fees felt better than a spectacular payday that tempted too many questions. Even in this narrowed version of his life, prosecutors kept building files. A labor peace payment here, a suspicious bankruptcy there, A sequence of charters that gave influence without bodies to back it up. Each item looked innocuous, but together they formed mosaics that juries could understand. The case memos became thicker than phone books. He responded with motions to suppress, challenges to wiretaps, appeals that questioned grand jury instructions. He won enough to keep hope alive. He lost enough to keep a prison bag packed. His temperament did not change. He still liked coffee counters where the waitress called him by name. He still paused to exchange pleasantries with a doorman who had once carried messages for him without ever opening an envelope. He still cultivated reporters, not by giving them scoops, but by letting them know he took their calls. That civility became part of his brand. It kept some people willing to meet him, even when meeting him carried risk. It disarmed others who expected the stereotype of a bully. He had always known that a polite man asking for a favor can move more freight than a threat shouted in a doorway. His efforts to clean his image never became a makeover. He didn't stage press conferences about reform. He didn't write essays about a new start. He simply kept to a path where influence grew quietly if he fed it, and trouble slowed if he kept his distance from spectacle. Where he could, he pushed back against the narrative that he ran rooms with fear. He claimed again and again that he managed tensions, prevented damage, and helped an industry function. The legal record tells a more complicated story. It shows a man who lied under oath when a truthful answer threatened to reveal hidden ties. It shows a man convicted of schemes that left creditors broken and firms bankrupt. It shows a lifetime of proximity to power that outlasted multiple attempts to cut him off from it. Through all of it, the city never quite decided whether to hate him or to admire the brutal clarity of his skill. Manufacturers who swore they'd never call him again saved his number anyway. Union insiders who denounced him from podiums sent intermediaries to ask his opinion after the microphones went dark. Political figures kept their distance in public and sent congratulations in private when a tricky negotiation ended without strikes. In that gray zone, he felt at home. He had built a career there, between written rules and unspoken understandings, between official minutes and what everyone in the room took for granted. He never pretended the scrutiny would fade. He accepted that his name drew attention, that reporters would ask whether he was meeting someone for lunch or for a deal, that agents would sit outside and watch him finish his soup. He accepted, too, that the courts would not forget his perjury and fraud convictions, which meant every new allegation arrived in a courtroom where jurors already had a sketch of him in their heads. He stacked careful routines against that disadvantage. He made sure his alibis were tidy, his paperwork clean where it had to be, and his conversations free of promises that could be misheard. His discipline was the last safeguard left to a man whose past followed him into every room. He had begun as a kid watching who held keys to the back doors. Now he watched for something else. The small shifts that tell you an era is ending. By the late 1960 seconds, he felt them everywhere. The garment center still churned, but the heart had moved. Trucks ran, but their routes answered to new ports and new schedules. The kind of union power he had mastered now lived under stricter rules, and the kind of fear he had depended on had to be disguised as caution. He remained who he had always been, a broker with a patient smile and a habit of finding the hinge in every situation. But the hinges he knew best had rusted, and the doors no longer opened as easily as they did when his name stood for a shortcut nobody wanted to admit they used. Winter light spilled along 7th Avenue, bouncing off glass towers that hadn't existed when he first learned how to turn a phone call into clout. He walked past cutters smoking by roll-up doors and drivers checking clipboards, and found himself counting small differences the way a card player counts odds. The city still hurried, but not quite the same way. Schedules depended on containers at the waterfront and flights bringing samples from faraway factories. That shift didn't erase what he knew. It only pushed his method into tighter alleys, where consequences felt sharper, and tolerance for improvisation had thinned. Part of the old safety net had vanished with the men who built it. Thomas Lucchese, whose steady touch had once knitted trucking lines, garment houses, and union chairs into a profitable pattern, was gone. A different management style took hold under successors who prized caution while federal strike forces grew teeth. He stayed valuable because he didn't need crowds to do his work. He needed a calendar, a list of names, and leverage that didn't leave bruises. Even so, The days when a manufactured delay could quietly buy a contract had faded. The scrutiny that followed him after the columnist's blinding never went away. It transformed into an ambient hum, a car parked too long at the curb, an unfamiliar face reading a magazine for an hour without turning a page, a new waiter who poured coffee with uncommon interest in the conversation at his booth. The path that led to that hum started with the outrage that had stunned the city. Reporters said the attack on the labor rider was meant to chill inquiry into the garment district's rackets. Detectives arrested the thrower and rolled up intermediaries, then set their sights higher. Grand juries assembled. A conspiracy indictment named him. While he insisted he had no hand in it, key witnesses wobbled. Some testimony didn't hold, and the case against him on that violent conspiracy failed. He left court without that conviction, but not without a price. Public memory doesn't track statutes of limitation. It tracks stories. In that story, people kept his name close to the horror, even after jurors and judges did not. Lawmakers took the moment and wrote rules to choke off the tricks he had turned into a living. The statute that reformed internal union governance demanding financial reports, putting audits at the center of oversight, and barring convicted felons from office for a full stretch aimed straight at the gray areas he had exploited. He adapted by putting other names on charters and by coaching officers he trusted to carry out strategies he refined in back rooms. He never liked shouting. A gentle word backed by a plausible worry still worked, even if every nudge now risked pulling agents into the room. The edifice he built from paper locals remained the best example of how he could turn something legal on its face into a potent lever. Charters with minimal or phantom memberships added up to a bundle of convention votes. In the hands of men who valued outcomes more than niceties, those votes could decide who chaired a national union and which policies rose to the top. He aligned with organizers who wanted a rapid ascent. The tally that lifted Jimmy Hoffa to national heights drew strength from charters linked to his quiet network. Investigators later documented how those locals existed more on letterhead than on shop floors. He defended the practice as legitimate organization effort in a fluid industry. Reformers called it manipulation. Senate hearings televised that argument into living rooms across the country and gave prosecutors a blueprint for follow-up cases. His legal picture, already clouded by the conspiracy drama, darkened again when perjury entered the record. Inquiries into labor corruption demanded answers under oath. He measured each response like a jeweler reading a scale. He refused to incriminate himself. Where the law saw wiggle room, he used it. Where it saw a narrow path, he tried to stand exactly inside the lines. In one matter, prosecutors said he crossed them and proved to a jury that he had lied about union dealings. A perjury conviction turned a public suspicion into a judicial fact. He was a man whom a court had found willing to deceive when the topic was his role in labor power. That finding trailed him through every later case. Defense lawyers fought to exclude it. Prosecutors pointed to it when they argued motive and method. The files didn't stop at perjury. In the years that followed, federal indictments charged that he had overseen schemes that quietly destroyed companies. Reporters labeled them bust-outs, a phrase that traveled quickly from bankruptcy courts to corner coffee shops. The gist was simple even if the mechanics sprawled across invoices, trucks, and warehouses. Investigators said certain firms appeared to thrive, ordered goods on credit, then converted those shipments to cash through off the books, sales, and left suppliers unpaid. By the time auditors arrived, the company shell collapsed. Creditors stared at empty racks, and the planners had moved on. He denied directing such operations and said prosecutors misunderstood ordinary business failures. Jurors in notable cases disagreed and convicted him of fraud and conspiracy counts. Appeals shaved edges, but core verdicts stood, and he went away for a meaningful term. Prison rarely rewrites a person's code, but it can refine a schedule. He learned how filings could pause punishments, how a new question of law might win a hearing that returned him briefly to the city he understood best. He used those returns to check on the terrain, which locals still mattered, which factories still operated on the knife-edge timing that made influence possible, which old friends would take his call. Outside, enforcement hardened. Strike forces pooled intelligence without the turf fights that used to slow them. Prosecutors in Manhattan and Brooklyn compared notes with federal teams. The Internal Revenue Service chased whether money that passed through diners and social clubs ever landed on a tax return. Even when he beat a count, the process consumed his calendar and reminded clients that his presence drew light they often preferred to avoid. The Teamsters changed too. Hoffa endured his own collisions with the law and left the stage under circumstances that turned into an enduring American puzzle. A new national leadership grew closer to management in tone, and local reformers seized openings to clean up shops. Monitors kept an eye on pension funds. Consent decrees restrained trustees who once moved money with little explanation. This didn't remove every avenue for leverage, but it reduced the number of chairs he could pull up to a table. The garment center itself surrendered volume to other states and overseas. That exodus undercut the economic panic he had previously turned into a service. The promise to keep trucks moving when a missed deadline could ruin a season. Deadlines still mattered, but fewer depended on one block in Manhattan. He compensated by broadening the set of businesses where his skill translated. Freight forwarding, distribution of small electronics, and related trades sometimes offered the same choke points: loading docks, time-critical deliveries, and the prospect of sudden labor irritation. The people inside those trades didn't always know his history. Those who did treated him like a veteran consultant with specialized knowledge of a city's quirks. He worked behind proxies and through cousins of old friends, kept his own name out of minutes and contracts, and let results speak for him. A buyer received an order on time after a talk with one of his intermediaries. A steward calmed a flare-up without escalating to a strike vote. For each resolution, there was a fee. He presented those payments as a fair price for avoiding chaos. Prosecutors called them coerced. Files kept arriving. Some charged extortion based on the theme that businesses were told to pay to avoid trouble. Others returned to paperwork crimes, arguing that he used bankruptcies to reduce debts created by fraud. Still others said he tried to influence union elections by controlling who got to be a member in the first place. The record shows a mix of outcomes. In some trials, witnesses crumbled or recanted. In others, juries found that the pattern repeated too exactly to be chance. He absorbed, in the 1,960 seconds and into the early 1,970 seconds, a stack of convictions that refined his image from rumor-driven menace to a man the courts had proven willing to rig systems for profit. He served sentences, appealed portions, and sought parole with the same steadiness he once brought to an all-night bargaining session. Through it all, his manner didn't shift much. He dressed with care for court, offered polite weather remarks to reporters who shouted questions he had no intention of answering, and kept lunches with people who claimed not to know him if a microphone appeared. That outward calm masked constant recalculation. He weighed whether a call would be read as advice or intimidation, whether a contribution to a community group would draw goodwill or suspicion, whether a quiet word to a politically connected acquaintance would solve a problem or become evidence. He breathed through each choice like a craftsman who knows one miscut can ruin a board. He could still count on loyalty in pockets of the city where favors had long half-lives. Some shop owners felt he had saved them from shutdowns and moved on with gratitude. A few union men remembered promotions he had engineered and paid back the kindness with votes or signatures when he asked. Those ties helped him hold a presence, even when laws wanted him gone from any union role. The favors also kept him on investigators' lists. Agents understood that influence doesn't evaporate with a prison term, it just moves to different rooms. So they kept listening, kept watching, kept noting who waved when he crossed a lobby. The practical impact of high-profile TV hearings and new statutes went beyond paperwork. They changed people's feelings about risk. A manufacturer who once would have paid a consulting fee and moved on now called a lawyer instead. A steward who might have accepted a suggestion from a friend decided to record the conversation or to pass it along to internal monitors. That cooling of appetite for gray arrangements forced him to slow down and take smaller bites. He traded big, fast deals for a sequence of modest adjustments that didn't trigger alarms. He still made a living in that narrowed lane, but it took twice the effort for half the outcome. He did not disappear. He seemed to prefer the role that had brought him there in the first place. Not a front-page flameout, but the person you called when production stalled for reasons nobody wanted to spell out in a memo. He didn't talk about reform or repentance. He spoke about efficiency, about preventing loss, about the discipline it takes to keep busy people from going to war over misunderstandings that cost money. Advocate or schemer depended on where you stood. The courts had their say in specific instances. He had his answer when reporters asked about reputation. He would nod, smile, comment on a hometown baseball score, and move on to the next appointment. Time pressed more heavily now. Younger figures with fewer scars and less baggage offered similar services for a lower fee. Some had learned by watching him. Others learned from collisions with the very agencies that had spent years learning his habits. He tried to remain valuable by offering something the newcomers couldn't sell. A map in his head of how the old garment district, trucking contractors, and local unions fit together even after the landscape changed. He treated that map like an heirloom you don't show often, but bring out when you need to make an important point. It still persuaded people who remembered the chaos of earlier days and wanted to avoid its return. There were limits he could not cross anymore. The union office doors were closed by law to anyone with his record. Pension funds that once seemed like piggy banks came with auditors who asked unfriendly questions. Political patrons who used to enjoy backroom problem-solving now worried that even a benign handshake would become a headline. He adjusted to a smaller life, dense with obligation but stripped of ceremony. In that life, the balance between risk and reward narrowed to a fine line. One call too many could spark a grand jury. One call too few could cost a client who needed quick action. He walked that line with the same poise he had shown as a younger man, though the stakes now came wrapped in a new kind of fatigue. He carried that weariness into the 1,970 seconds, still active, still careful, still shadowed. Files from those years show continued pressure. Fresh fraud counts tied to company failures, extortion theories brought by owners who finally felt safe enough to speak, and proceedings that revisited old union maneuvers with new evidence. He fought a familiar pattern: arrest, bail, motions, trial, appeal, like a veteran enduring a season schedule he knew by heart. Some verdicts landed hard and kept him away from the sidewalks he loved. Others left him walking back out into daylight with a nod to the gallery and a promise from counsel to keep pushing. He had made a world out of minor adjustments that ached like major decisions to the people who paid for them. The city around him had changed addresses and languages and tools, but deadlines still punished delay, and concentration of leverage still created opportunity. He belonged to that slice of New York where urgency could be turned into a product, sold to those who feared it most. Whether he was a fixer who kept lines moving or a racketeer who profited from manufactured trouble, became a question that divided rooms long after courts stamped sentences and drew lines on who could sit in which chair. He understood why. The city runs on contradictions, and his life put several of them in one coat pocket. By the early 70s, a rhythm set in that felt both familiar and claustrophobic. He woke to the same kettle hiss, read the same papers that pretended to be surprised he still mattered, and stepped into the same street where eyes tracked him from coffee carts, police sedans, and shop windows. He had lived with attention for years, but age changes how attention feels. The noise didn't rattle him. The drag did. Each errand took longer. Each handshake had a question hidden in it, and every favor now came with a nagging calculation about who might be listening 2 tables over. He still found work in places where a timetable could break a business. In warehouses along the rivers and in cramped lofts off 8th Avenue, shipments needed to move or get stuck behind disputes that had no clear language in any contract. He spoke that unprinted language fluently. He could call a steward, who could call a foreman, who could call a driver, and the problem dissolved before lunch. Owners measured him by that utility, not by editorials. They knew the headlines. They also knew what a missed delivery did to a season. When a quick understanding kept cutting rooms humming, they drew their own conclusions about who provided value. The official record kept pace with those private arrangements. Federal teams had learned his habits from years of hearings, taped interviews, and the testimony of defectors who mapped the families and named the specialists in each trade. Public confessions by insiders described how certain crews inserted themselves into trucking, waste hauling, and the garment corridor. In those accounts, he appeared as the labor broker who could manufacture delegates, manage locals from the shadows, and steer contracts without ever taking a recorded vote. He never confirmed those portraits. He didn't need to. The dossiers had their own momentum, and investigators didn't forget. Paper locals remained the best window into his craft. The scheme didn't look dramatic on first glance. A charter came from a national office. Officers filed forms. Dues trickled in, sometimes from a handful of real workers, sometimes from names added to roles without bodies behind them. That created votes on paper, and votes decided who sat in the big chairs. With enough charters, a coalition could tilt a convention and shape policy across an entire industry. Journalists pieced together how those locals fed larger ambitions inside the Teamsters. Reformers argued that such manipulation robbed real members of a say. He countered that organizing is messy and that new locals begin small. Courts didn't have to decide the philosophy, they had to decide whether specific acts broke laws. In that narrower arena, perjury and forged statements became the focus, and on those counts, he took hits that followed him for the rest of his life. What made the next phase different was the prominence of bankruptcy work in the indictments. Fraud was the word on the charge sheets, but the mechanics were rooted in trade. A business appeared healthy, boosted by inventories that looked strong on paper. Credit followed. Goods arrived. Those goods vanished too. Off-the-book buyers. When invoices matured, the company folded, leaving suppliers unpaid while the planners walked away with cash in clean hands. Prosecutors said he was not just a consultant in that world. They said he orchestrated collapses, protected by a labor reputation that kept auditors and creditors at bay long enough to complete the cycle. He denied it. He claimed he advised struggling firms and had nothing to do with their failures. More than once, juries heard both stories and chose the government's version. Those verdicts put him behind bars for stretches that counted. He served time with the same reserve he brought to free life. He kept his head down, read everything he could about procedure, and treated each filing like a move in an ongoing match that didn't end when a cell door shut. His lawyers challenged wiretaps, questioned lineups, and appealed instructions to juries. Some wins arrived on narrow points that shortened a term or set up a retrial. Many losses landed with the weight of a gavel and sent him back to a bunk already worn by other men who had played similar games. When he returned home on parole or after a completed sentence, he moved carefully, seeing who remained friendly and who now needed distance to keep their own lives calm. The industry he had mastered kept changing under his feet. Cutting moved to cheaper towns, then to new countries. The midtown blocks that once decided entire fashion seasons lost their grip on the calendar. Even so, 1,000 small factories and distributors survived on the edges of the city and still wrestled with the same pressures that had created his market in the first place. Trucks arrived late. Crews argued about overtime. A line supervisor caught between competing demands needed a path that didn't require lawyers. He offered that path to anyone willing to ignore the clatter around his name. The price was straightforward: a fee for peace. Prosecutors would later argue that peace purchased under implied threat is not peace at all. Customers, juggling their own risks, did not always want to test that theory. He had always moved within the Lucchese orbit, where quiet influence counted more than fireworks. That connection did not vanish when leaders died or went to ground. It adapted. New bosses avoided cameras and tolerated no flamboyance. They liked him because he needed neither. He fit into a system that preferred a calm word in a doorway to a brawl in the street. His role remained essentially administrative: align unions where necessary, discourage unrest when profitable, and nudge votes in directions that kept contracts favorable. Those who studied organized crime would later say that men like him stitched together the everyday power that made the spectacular headlines possible. He saw it differently. He thought of himself as a problem solver in a city that creates problems by the hour. Investigations, however, do not run on self-descriptions. They run on documents, witnesses, and the patience to connect thousands of mundane events until a pattern emerges. State and federal offices assembled those patterns painstakingly. They called him to grand juries over and over. He answered some questions, refused others, and drew contempt citations that added short stints to a record already written in thick black lines. In open court, he tried to separate ordinary labor influence from criminal coercion. He argued that warnings about possible delays do not amount to threats, that consultations are not shakedowns, that an introduction to a union officer is not a conspiracy. Sometimes that distinction persuaded a jury. In many instances, it did not. There were years when it felt like every month carried a new hearing. Referees in bankruptcy court discussed how inventories were valued and whether orders were ever meant to be paid for. Criminal courts examined if those values and orders formed part of a deliberate plan to extract cash and dump liabilities. Tax authorities asked where fees and gifts had gone. He avoided flamboyant spending that might have handed auditors a roadmap. He kept a modest apartment, ate at diners, and tipped the same amount he had always tipped. But money leaves traces, even when it moves quietly. Prosecutors followed those traces into the company books of clients and associates, then back to meetings in coffee shops where he supposedly offered stabilization in exchange for envelopes described as retainers. Through all of it, he kept old habits. He was courteous with reporters. He nodded at cops he had once known on first-name terms, when they were rookies assigned to a footpost by a loading dock. That outward calm made him look untouchable to some, and harmless to others, which could be the most dangerous mask a man in his position wears. The calm also irritated reformers, who had spent years trying to free locals from outside hands. They wanted loud reckonings, tearful confessions, and declarations that the past was done. He gave none of that. He offered no apologies, and asked for no apologies from his critics. He simply worked the edges of the city's impatience until something gave and a job got done. The public version of his life hit its high notes in long hearings and splashy arrests, but the private version remained the steady churn of logistics and leverage. A small craft shop owed suppliers and needed a shipment to catch up. A driver refused a route after a dispute about seniority. A foreman worried that correcting a minor violation would trigger a larger fight. He inserted himself in those spaces, earned a fee when outcomes went his way, and absorbed heat when an employer or union officer decided a disagreement had slid into intimidation. That is why his legal problems never ended at a single theme. They ranged across perjury, conspiracy, extortion allegations, and the intricate frauds associated with companies that collapsed after a brief, artificial glow. Only in quiet moments did the weight of years show. He had outlasted many of the men who taught him the craft. He had also outlasted an era. Television had turned hearings into national events. New laws punished the exact tricks he had perfected when rules were murkier. The Teamsters went through leadership changes that redefined alliances. The garment center shrank to a symbol still storied, still busy, but no longer the city's beating industrial heart. Yet even as the main stage dimmed, sidelines remained lively, and that is where he stayed. A veteran free agent running plays he knew to be riskier with each season. The prosecutions that marked these years often read alike. A company inflated assets, borrowed against phantom strength, acquired goods, turned those goods into quick cash, and then cratered. The record shows that he was named as a planner or protector in multiple such matters. Convictions in several courts carried him into federal custody again and again. Appeals refined sentences but rarely erased them. The pattern reinforced a picture of a man who had moved beyond the early days of labor leverage into a field where corporate shells and legal filings became weapons. He did not accept that narrative. He called himself a consultant and denied any intent to defraud. But intent is a jury's province, and on that question he often lost. Even then, glimmers of the old efficiency lingered. In some disputes, he still brokered ceasefires that saved both sides from ruin. Those successes helped explain why he never quite vanished from the city's working map. People who rely on deadlines will always pay for certainty. He had sold that product since he was young, and he kept selling a version of it until his last active years. The city, practical to its bones, made room for a man who could move boxes from point A to point B without a strike vote or a broken promise at a crucial hour. That room shrank as oversight improved, but it never fully closed. He also learned to live with scars that don't show. Every trial takes a layer off. Friendships thin, family life buckles. He was not a creature of confession, so he never told reporters what it felt like to miss weddings or to call home from a payphone after lights out. He never used illness to win sympathy. When he hurt, he kept the hurt to himself. He looked smaller in later photographs, but the suit still fit. The smile still sat neatly on his face, and his voice kept the same flat cadence that had once soothed men who panicked easily when freight didn't appear on schedule. By the time he reached the end of that decade, he had become less a threat in headlines and more a case study in how a city can produce specialists in the management of fear. He had run every variation of the same basic equation. Where urgency exists, someone can sell a shortcut. Authorities tried to erase the market by reducing urgency through rules and oversight. They succeeded in parts. He didn't argue with the math. He adjusted to a leaner version of his trade and kept moving until the calendar, not a courtroom, told him it was time to slow down. He never wrote memoirs. He never explained himself beyond a few clipped replies after a verdict or at a courthouse door. His story, as it appears in public records, is a sequence of charges and counterclaims, losses and wins, bans and workarounds, alarms and cold lunches, at the same stained counters he had frequented since he was a boy. If you want to understand what he did, you watch how boxes and people moved when he was present, and how they faltered when he wasn't. If you want to understand why prosecutors never let go, you count the creditors left empty by the collapses he was tied to, and tally the hours investigators spent unraveling corporate plots that looked at first like bad luck. In that push and pull lay the truth of his later life, a chapter written in ledgers, subpoenas, and the stubborn persistence of a man who believed that every deadline creates an opening for someone who knows where to stand. He measured the city by clocks and corridors, by who could make a promise at 9 and keep it by noon. The 70s moved differently. Federal strike forces grew more coordinated. Grand juries ran longer. Reporters learned the jargon of invoices, charters, and warehouse receipts. He adapted, because adapting had always been his edge. Even so, the constant friction of surveillance wore at him. A walk to the corner stand for coffee meant eyes on his back and a notepad across the street. He stayed polite. He never rushed. He still believed that timing defeats spectacle, and that a calm tone unsettles opponents more than a shout. Trials from the prior decade had trimmed his freedom. The perjury finding carved a permanent dent in his credibility. Fraud convictions tied to collapsed companies had cost him years, and labeled him in the public record as a planner, not a bystander. He returned to the same neighborhoods with a smaller circle and a sharper sense of where the traps Saturday. He kept the rhythm many parolees learned. Check in, follow conditions, work with buffers who kept his name off signatures. His enemies said the buffers were puppets. He called them colleagues. Whatever the label, the arrangement bought him time to keep earning from the only set of skills he trusted. The people who called him still faced the same problems. Freight needed to move. Disputes threatened to flare into stoppages no one could afford. He remained a quiet specialist in turning heat down. He did it with a call to a steward who respected the old man's judgment, with a favor to a foreman who needed backup, with a whisper about schedules that discouraged brinkmanship. Critics insisted that his very presence created tension he then charged to relieve. He rejected that as convenient rhetoric. He said he stabilized an unstable corner of commerce. The legal system tried to sort those claims in courtroom after courtroom, count after count. Federal prosecutors adopted a long-game strategy. Rather than treat each complaint as a standalone, they layered cases. Mail fraud and bankruptcy counts underpinned the broader picture of systematic abuse of credit and inventory. Extortion theories captured the labor angle. Pay a fee or expect delays that could sink a line. Tax charges sought to close gaps between his apparent income and the steady expenses of someone who rarely missed a meal at his preferred counters. He met that strategy with motions, suppression challenges, and appeals that targeted procedure. He knew that a flaw in a wiretap affidavit or a misstep in a grand jury instruction could undo months of investigation. Sometimes it did. More often, judgments held. The Teamsters no longer offered the same avenue for building large blocks of influence. Leadership changed, and national politics within the union shifted after the disappearance of the man he had once helped with delegates. Oversight stiffened. Consent decrees reached into locals that had previously answered to regional fixers. He remained connected to certain corners of the trucking world, but he no longer pretended he could swing national outcomes with a stack of charters. That era had closed. What remained was the older craft he had mastered first. Deal with immediate problems, minimize noise, and collect for the service. Investigators never forgot the link between his rise and the garment district. Though production moved outward, thousands of small shops still cut, stitched, and shipped from New York addresses. A slowdown anywhere in that chain rippled outward, and ripples meant leverage. He was accused of using that leverage to extract steady money from owners worried about interruptions not covered by contract terms. He insisted that any payments were consulting fees for reducing conflict. The difference between a consultation and a shakedown lived in nuance and tone. Prosecutors tried to flatten that nuance into clean lines a jury could follow. Sometimes their witnesses did not hold up. Sometimes they did, and verdicts arrived that matched the government's narrative. The collapse scheme stayed on the docket because they produced a paper trail that jurors could see. A company swelled on credit after asset valuations rose without physical proof to match. Orders increased. Goods were received, then found their way to side buyers who paid cash. When invoices matured, the business fell apart. Creditors summoned lawyers and asked why their pallets had vanished. Trustees combed through ledgers and found gaps. He appeared in these matters as the advisor who helped select officers, the connector who arranged lines of credit, or the strategist who shielded the operation with union clout while the clock ticked. He denied planning any collapse and said he had tried to salvage firms on the edge. Multiple verdicts said otherwise and sent him back inside. Inside, he lived within routines. He read court opinions and collected notes for his attorneys. He avoided posture. He understood that a reputation for stability can shorten a sentence more than bluster ever could. Parole boards want to see predictability, so he gave them predictability. Outside, he kept tabs through relatives and long-term friends who still believed he had been overcharged in some matters and misunderstood in others. They told him which locals had survived, which had merged, and which shops still needed someone who could translate tension into calm. He built a map from those updates and used it on release to move quickly, but carefully. He was never a man to abandon old ties. The Lucchese circle still valued a broker who never sought spotlight and who knew how to keep schedules reliable across entire neighborhoods. After leadership transitions, his role stayed administrative, a facilitator, not a field captain. That understated niche suited the tone of the times. Big shows of power attracted too much risk. Quiet leverage remained profitable in a world obsessed with appearances. He ensured that particular routes ran without surprise, and that certain gatherings produced the decisions his friends preferred. He accepted that every one of these tasks carried the possibility of a tap, a tail, or a subpoena. Public memory kept his name linked to the worst incident from the 50s. He could not outrun that. The columnist he was accused of targeting continued to write and made a career out of confronting figures like him. Whenever a new indictment landed, papers revived the old story and reminded readers that the attack had turned a critic into a symbol. He said nothing. He rarely commented, even when silence was read as admission. The law had spoken on that conspiracy, and he had escaped that particular conviction, but the association clung stubbornly. It hardened the posture of jurors who read their morning paper on the way to court. He had other types of trouble too. Contempt citations arrived when he declined to answer grand jury questions he believed went too far. Those brought short stays and fines. He racked up violations for what the court called unlawful participation in union affairs while under a statutory ban on office holders with felony records. The letters of that law did not always match the way business got done, and he paid for each mismatch. He responded by standing a little farther back, adding an extra layer between himself and the place where signatures formed. That distance reduced his effectiveness, but increased his longevity. He learned to ignore the small indignities that came with constant scrutiny. A table cleared suddenly when he sat down. A landlord, who had once accepted envelopes, no longer took checks without a receipt. A shop owner who owed him a favor needed everything in writing because a cousin had joined the police academy. He didn't complain. He adjusted. He kept a clean wallet and a quiet daybook in his head. He remembered birthdays and used them as pretexts for calls that reopened channels without raising flags. He offered small kindnesses so people would take his call when he needed speed. He also learned to accept that younger men wanted his customers. Some came with hard edges and no patience. Others imitated his style but lacked his caution. He watched them make loud mistakes and saw the consequences play out in fast arrests that fed the evening news. He presented himself as the safer alternative. He emphasized his experience and his ability to deliver without drama. That sales pitch worked with clients who equated noise with risk. It kept him in the game a little longer than the calendar might have allowed otherwise. The longest fights were rarely about a single act. They were about patterns. Prosecutors drew timelines that began in the 30s and stretched through the decade. They traced how he moved from street-level hustle to union influence, to corporate manipulation. They showed how allies rotated through official roles while he remained the constant. He saw those presentations as narratives crafted for jurors, not as truth. He told himself that he navigated a world that rewarded efficiency and punished naivete. The distinction mattered to him even if it changed few minds outside his circle. He never admitted defeat in public. When he lost a case, he met the result with a small smile and a promise to appeal. When he won, he offered no victory lap. He left the building, took a slow breath on the sidewalk, and returned to his routine. He valued steadiness because it had carried him further than force ever could. In a city that prizes momentum, his refusal to lurch comforted clients and confused opponents. It also kept his story consistent in a way that made it hard for prosecutors to paint him as chaotic or out of control. As the decade wound down, health began to intrude in the ways it does when a man has spent too many seasons under strain. He looked thinner. His suits hung a little loose. Friends noticed he took more pauses between sentences. He did not discuss doctors. He kept appointments and kept pace. But the grind of travel between courtrooms and coffee counters took a toll. He knew it, and worked to hand off responsibilities to trusted lieutenants who could keep deliveries steady when he needed a day to rest. Even with the wear, his presence still mattered. A call from him still got answered. A nod from him still calmed. A room full of jittery people, watching clocks and imagining losses they couldn't cover. The talent that made him dangerous in the eyes of the law remained the same talent that made him valuable to people who equated calm with survival. He had spent a lifetime mastering that paradox, and he leaned on it in his final active years with the same quiet faith he had shown as a young man in a loud city. The record of those late cases reads like a ledger of a specialist nearing the end of his run. Fresh indictments arrived on refined versions of old themes, including fraud tied to distressed firms and accusations that he had influenced union decisions without eligibility. He fought them with dwindling energy but undiminished discipline. Some matters ended in negotiated outcomes that spared everyone a trial. Others produced verdicts that kept his calendar crowded with motions and prison transport dates. The system had learned him. He had learned the system. They met each other halfway, in a long stalemate measured in years. What never changed was the city's reliance on timed movement. Deadlines still punished delay. People still paid for assurance. He lived inside that truth until he could not keep pace, then stepped back and watched younger men learn the same lessons he had learned decades earlier. In the distance he kept from the main stage, he found a smaller version of the life he had always led. Discreet calls, quiet solutions, and a reputation that made rooms quiet the moment he entered. Mid-70s mornings felt spare. He rose early, read the papers for names and dates, and treated each headline like a weather report. Storms came often. Federal strike forces had matured into steady machines. Agents compared notes across offices, and subpoenas landed without drama. He adjusted by shrinking his footprint. Meetings happened in moving cars, on sidewalks, or in rooms with radios playing loud enough to cover small talk. He still kept the same manners: thank the waiter, hold a door, ask after someone's family, because those habits made rooms relax. He needed rooms to relax. His trade depended on the sense that tension could be managed if the right person spoke in the right order. The arcs of his life were now familiar to anyone who followed labor news. He began as a teenager who learned the city's back doors, built influence around trucks and sewing floors, and turned charters into votes that magnified his voice. The televised hearings froze that image. Millions saw him sit under hot lights and invoke his rights, while senators pushed questions about locals that existed on paper more than on shop floors. Afterward, his legal record thickened. A perjury conviction put a scar on his credibility that never healed. Fraud cases tied to company collapses added hard time. Short stints for contempt landed when he declined grand jury questions. Bans on union office followed him, and prosecutors accused him of violating those bans whenever a steward or officer seemed too aligned with his preferences. Even with that weight, he still found customers who valued calm. Small firms near the river lofts and in Queens industrial strips called when a delivery stalled or when a scheduling dispute threatened to snowball. E favor de quiet remedios. A word to a shop steward about overtime rotation. A reminder to a foreman that a grievance could be processed without stopping a line. A chat with a dispatcher to bump a truck higher on a list. Those steps avoided loud confrontations that turned into headlines. Owners paid for that. Prosecutors countered that the service relied on fear planted by reputation. He said reputation was the point. Who else could persuade rivals to step back without a scene? The strongest cases against him in those years focused on business collapse schemes. Trustees and agents learned to read books the way a longshoreman reads the tide. They saw patterns, inventories that outpaced reality, credit that climbed without collateral, orders that flowed into a warehouse, and then out the back without invoices to match. When accounts came due, the entity failed, and creditors stared at rows of empty racks. In indictments, he appeared as the organizer who recruited nominal officers, arranged financing, smoothed labor friction to buy time, and then stepped away as filings hit court. He denied planning any failure and said he had tried to rescue firms. Multiple juries disagreed and returned verdicts that labeled him a conspirator and calculated insolvency. Those convictions sent him away for stretches that pressed into middle age. He passed those months with discipline. He read appellate decisions, marked up opinions for his attorneys, and memorized deadlines that might produce a hearing or a conditional release. He never complained publicly. He never painted himself as a victim. He spoke in practical terms about filings, motion calendars, and the small victories that trimmed months from a sentence. When he returned to the city, he avoided grand gestures. A quiet phone call here, a lunch there, a check on which locals had merged or been placed under monitors. He moved as if he believed momentum could be rebuilt, one small promise at a time. Leadership changes among his old associates reshaped the map. After Thomas Lucchese's era ended, Carmine Tramonti held the reins briefly, while narcotics cases cut into the upper tier. Then Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo took charge and preferred velvet over brass. That approach matched his own. He didn't run crews. He calibrated schedules and votes. Under the new order, ostentation drew penalties. He kept suits conservative, conversations clipped, and paperwork distant. He handled introductions between business owners and union intermediaries, nudged outcomes, and maintained a calm front that reassured clients who feared drama more than cost. The garment center's contraction continued. Major labels shifted cutting and stitching out of Manhattan while sample rooms and showrooms stayed. That left a narrowed but intense pipeline, where delays hurt even more because margins were thin. He knew that pressure inside out and sold reassurance across smaller accounts. At the same time, distribution hubs near the airports, in Long Island City and in northern New Jersey, created fresh routes where timing mattered. He learned those routes, made friends among dispatchers, and stayed useful by understanding how a missed pallet at dawn could ripple through a whole day's schedule. Reporters kept pulling at the thread that connected him to an attack that had shocked the city 2 decades earlier. They wrote his name whenever they revisited the outrage against the columnist who kept writing despite injuries that never healed. He never discussed it. Courts had failed to pin that conspiracy on him, but the association stuck. It colored everything. Jurors recognized the outline. Prosecutors leaned on it when they framed his character. He relied on the principle that verdicts speak louder than rumors, yet the rumor lived beside every new case like a headline that wouldn't fade. Legal pressure adapted as he adapted. When offices accused him of extortion in the classic sense and failed to convince a jury, they returned with mail fraud and bankruptcy charges that revolved around documents rather than tone. When those landed, he met them with a blitz of procedural challenges. He questioned probable cause in searches, attacked the breadth of subpoenas, and argued that grand jury instructions misled panelists about what amounted to a scheme. Some panels agreed in part and trimmed counts. Others left judgments intact. He accepted outcomes without theatrics and built appeals where he could, patient as ever. The ban on holding union office shaped his days more than any single statute. Violating it carried penalties that piled up quickly. He learned to work through intermediaries who did not have felony records, teaching them how to conduct meetings, draft minutes, and present proposals that moved contracts forward. He showed them when to slow a vote and when to push one. He insisted on clean public records while keeping his own advice off paper. Authorities called that a sham designed to hide control. He called it survival in a system that barred him even from formal advisory roles. Every time a steward aligned with his view, investigators drew lines back to him and asked a judge to test whether advice had become illegal influence. Tax issues never left the table. Agents traced consulting fees, found money orders that didn't sit cleanly against declared income, and tried to show skimming. He lived modestly compared with flashier figures, which limited the power of those narratives. Still, gaps mattered more than lifestyle, and auditors found gaps. That produced hearings and occasional charges that bundled with other counts. He fought those as fiercely as any because tax cases reach into every corner of a life. He had long advised others to keep receipts and plausible explanations. He followed his own rules, yet in a career that wandered through cash-heavy environments, auditors still found places to pry. Aging brought limits that strategy could not erase. He looked thinner. He took more care walking curb edges slick with winter slush. He paused longer before standing. When a meeting ended, he kept appointments, but he no longer raced from one side of town to the other in a single morning. He began trusting longtime deputies with tasks he once handled personally. He watched loyalties the way a farmer watches weather, scanning for hints that someone might switch allegiances under pressure from a subpoena or a promise. The circle tightened. He tried to keep it warm with small rituals, birthday calls, holiday baskets, quiet visits when someone's parent died. He lived long enough to see younger brokers copy his low-drama tone. Some learned the right lessons and stayed quiet, effective, and cautious. Others borrowed the surface without the discipline underneath, mixing greed with speed and ending up in cuffs on evening news shows. He shook his head when he saw that. He knew the city rewards restraint, not celebrations of leverage. He had made a career from never looking like a crisis, even when the stakes at a loading dock or inside a cramped union office could ruin a quarter's profit. For a whole building, one truth remained constant. He thrived in places where rules leave gaps. Contracts cannot picture every scenario a factory floor throws up at 4 in the morning. Schedules cannot anticipate every pileup on an artery or mechanical breakdown in a freight elevator. Those gaps breed panic. He sold relief from that panic. The relief came at a price, and the government argued that the price looked like tribute collected under a shadow. He countered that fear existed whether he was there or not, and that his presence turned fear into something manageable. The debate followed him from the first newspaper stories to the last hearing he ever attended. By the middle of the decade, his legal calendar grew heavy again. Cases in federal court combined allegations of bankruptcy manipulation with fresh claims that he had shaped union decisions despite bans. One matter painted a chain of shell companies that ordered goods, diverted them, and then used filings to cast off debt. Another focused on a local election, where challengers claimed members had been enrolled or excluded to control a ballot. He fought both with the same dry patience. Lawyers argued jury instructions, burden of proof, and admissibility of old convictions. He sat still, nodded to friends in the gallery, and left outcomes to the system he knew too well. He spent enough time in custody that healthcare inside the system became part of his routine. He learned which institutions handled chronic conditions better, which doctors listened, and which facilities allowed a bit of sunlight in the yard. When he won transfers to medical units, he treated them as strategic victories and used them to rest, read, and write letters that kept him connected. Outside, his network maintained the lanes he had opened. They kept an eye on garment shipments, small freight lines, and distribution jobs where his brand of calm still mattered. He no longer insisted on being the first call. He was content to be the second or third, if that kept him useful without drawing extra light. Public conversation around unions shifted during those years. Reformers emphasized transparency. Some locals embraced elections that brought in new officers untouched by old arrangements. Others struggled, tugged between past habits and new rules. National politics within the Teamsters settled into a different pattern, and prosecutors turned attention to pension oversight and airport cargo. He watched with interest. He had spent earlier years helping an aspiring leader collect votes from locals that barely existed. That tactic had been exposed, condemned, and countered with reporting requirements. He took the change as another reality to work around. The city always invents new gates. His craft was learning who kept keys. He carried his story without embellishment. No memoir, no extended interviews, no late conversion to public confessions. He kept his views simple. He had provided a service in a rough trade. He had fought cases he believed were overdrawn, and he had served time when juries ruled against him. Critics wanted contrition. Fans wanted defiance. He offered neither, just the steady cadence of a man who measured life by appointments, filings, deliveries, and the quiet satisfaction of a problem that stopped being a problem before lunch. That stance kept him consistent as the decade tilted toward its end. What remained unresolved was whether he could keep pace with a system that had learned nearly every move he liked to make. Agents knew his rhythms. Prosecutors knew his legal strategies. Judges recognized his name and the kinds of arguments that trailed it. He relied on discipline to meet that familiarity. He avoided improvisations that bred mistakes. He accepted that wins would be narrower and losses would cut deeper. He trusted that as long as rooms needed someone to lower the temperature without breaking anything, there would be work for him, even if the price included another court date he didn't want, and a winter walk-up courthouse steps that seemed steeper with each passing year. Late in the decade, he moved with a measured pace that said he had learned how to stretch an hour. He kept early appointments, answered calls with the same even tone, and gave the impression that there was always more time than worry suggested. That calm had been his calling card for years. Now it doubled as a shield. Agents still waited outside diners. A note-taker still held the same seat near a window. The city no longer flinched when his name appeared in print. It simply filed the headline with all the other familiar news about people who navigated between labor and business. He didn't chase attention. He never had. He stuck to small tables, kept conversations short, and preferred the long walk to a loud ride. Repetition didn't bore him. It soothed him. He liked ritual. The second cup poured without asking, the nod from a dispatcher, the small wave from a guard at a lobby desk who had read his name on too many assignment sheets. Those habits gave him a framework while the streets shifted beneath everyone else's feet. The garment center had thinned, yet deadlines still stacked up on clipboards. Freight routes had leapfrogged to new warehouses and airports, yet a missing pallet could still wreck a day's plan. He stayed relevant by knowing which call saved an hour and which question avoided a standoff. People hired him for that sense, not for his history, though the history followed each appointment like an echo he couldn't quiet. His legal story in these years looked like a ledger of patience and attrition. Indictments kept arriving with a familiar mix: mail fraud, bankruptcy fraud, conspiracy, and allegations that he had nudged union officers from behind a curtain, despite bans designed to keep him far from any gavel. He answered with the same tools. Lawyers filed motions that argued the government had stretched the facts or used tools too broad for the job. Judges granted some requests and denied others. In one courthouse he might lose on a key point. In another he might win a ruling that shaved months off a sentence. He treated every outcome as a detail to fold into the next step. Business collapse cases remained the spine of the government's approach. Investigators had grown fluent in the peculiar arithmetic of the trade. They checked how receivables had been factored, whether inventory numbers matched what sat on racks, and if purchase orders lined up with deliveries. Factoring companies, burned by losses, cooperated more readily than they once had. When examiners traced a shipment that left a warehouse and never found its way to an invoice, they drew lines through calendars and turned those lines into conspiracy counts. In court, witnesses described companies that swelled with credit, moved product into cash, and then dissolved, leaving creditors with nothing but claims. His side said those were rescues that failed. Prosecutors said they were collapses built like a plan. Jurors in key trials saw the plan and returned verdicts that kept him in custody well into the decade. Inside, he maintained a tempo that had carried him through earlier stretches. He read carefully, exercised within limits, and kept to a few steady friends who didn't ask for favors he couldn't grant. He knew which institutions handled medical issues with more care, and which ones answered requests without games. He worked the system without theatrics, never shouting, never threatening, always returning to filings and dates. When he earned a transfer to a medical unit, he used the quieter time to write letters that kept ties alive, and to sketch the maps in his head of who still ran which shops and which locals might actually hold a fair vote. He didn't pretend he could rebuild the influence he once held. He thought instead about smaller, specific problems he could still solve with a recommendation that cost no one pride. On the outside, people argued about whether he forced problems and then charged to remove them. That question had shadowed him since the 50s. Some business owners swore they paid because the alternative felt worse, even if nobody said out loud what that alternative was. Others said they had called him because the alternative was chaos, and he delivered calm. The courts tried to convert that ambiguity into verdicts. Sometimes they succeeded, grounding decisions in documents, dates, and the testimony of men who had shuffled papers under his direction. Other times, the case hinged on the atmosphere of a conversation, and the result collapsed under the weight of subjectivity. He had long accepted that the most damaging event linked to his name would outlive him. When columnists revisited the attack that had stunned the city, his role returned to the page too, even though he had not been convicted of that conspiracy. The victim never stopped writing, and he never stopped insisting that the underworld had tried to silence him. Every anniversary brought fresh stories, and those stories replayed the same cast. He didn't protest. He never tried to litigate the past through interviews. He used the same response he used for everything: a small smile, a gentle shrug, and a retreat into a routine that felt safer than any argument. The people around him changed as the decade closed. Old allies aged out, or decided that the risk-to-reward ratio no longer justified anything beyond legitimate work. Younger men arrived, with an appetite for speed, and the belief that they could outrun the kind of attention that had become his daily weather. He watched as some of them burned hot and fast, fell into the hands of task forces, and learned under fluorescent lights what he had learned years earlier under cameras. He was not sentimental. He didn't deliver lectures. He simply avoided their noise and offered himself as the low-drama alternative to anyone who still needed a hand, price to be discussed, discretion assumed. His health began to insist on its own schedule. He moved a bit slower. A winter cold stayed longer than it used to. He noticed how stairs seemed steeper, how doors felt heavier, and how a morning could vanish after a single appointment if he didn't guard his energy. Doctors visited more often. He gave them the same courtesy he gave waiters: a thank you, a direct look, and no complaints. He had no taste for confessions. He wasn't about to start telling stories to win sympathy. He still kept jackets pressed, shoes shined, and his voice even, as if neatness and tone could will the body into holding steady a few seasons more. Court calendars didn't consider his fatigue. In the later 70s, he faced new proceedings that combined pieces of older themes. One matter laid out a chain of orders, shipments, and filings, designed to shed debt after assets had been siphoned into cash. Another accused him of guiding a slate of union officers while legally barred from any role, a charge built from meeting notes, telephone toll records, and the testimony of insiders who had turned witness after receiving letters marked with federal seals. He defended himself the way he always had, by pressing the law on points of proof and procedure rather than offering a sweeping story. He let his attorneys argue that involvement had been overstated or misread, that introductions are not commands, that a suggestion is not control. The juries weighed paper and memory and, in crucial instances, sided with the government. Those decisions kept him in federal custody as the decade tipped toward its end. He had lived enough of his life inside to recognize the rhythms, the count, the call for mail, the sudden silence after lights out that made paper rustle sound as loud as a shout. He maintained small rituals to guard against the flattening of time: morning reading, afternoon exercise, letters on certain days, and short lists that kept his mind in motion. He asked for nothing beyond what could be put on a form. Guards respected him for that. Other men did too. He had once built a reputation for turning deadlines into leverage. Now he measured days by how little he needed from anyone. The people who cared for him beyond the walls showed up as often as rules allowed. They brought small comforts: a memory from a holiday dinner, a story about a neighbor's child, a note about an old friend who had moved south to warmer air. Those visits kept him anchored to something that felt normal. He didn't discuss cases during them. He didn't list grievances. He let others talk. He listened, stored the details, and later replayed them in his head at night when the institutional quiet pressed against thought like weight. Outside, the city kept its relentless schedule. Barges slid downriver. Planes crossed a low Sunday. The garment center still staged shows and shipped samples. Even as most production occurred elsewhere, the Teamsters continued to evolve under leadership that favored process and reduced the space for the kind of improvisation he had once sold. The agencies that had spent 20 years learning his habits now knew the habits of everyone who wanted to copy him. They looked for patterns as routines rather than exceptions. They moved cases forward methodically, cared less about headlines, and more about consistency. In that environment, he looked like a figure from another moment, a man whose skills had been forged in a specific corner of the city's industrial past. Yet the last calls to his circle before he left the stage for good still sounded the same as the first. A driver worried about a schedule, a foreman anxious about a decision, an owner afraid a late shipment would domino into a missed season. He had always spoken to those anxieties with a kind of practical empathy. He sold reassurance in a place that runs on nerves. If he profited from that transaction, he never apologized. He knew his value and named it without explanation. By early 1979, his body no longer allowed the sort of steady movement that had defined him. Medical exams became the main item on his calendar. A physician's voice replaced a judge's as the sound that mattered most in a week. He handled the shift with the same composure he had brought to court. He made no speeches. He followed instructions. He did not dramatize pain. Requests for care moved through channels, and he accepted what arrived without public complaint. For a man who had spent a life adjusting to other people's schedules, there was a symmetry in letting nurses tell him when to rest. He died that year in custody after an illness that had crept forward quietly. The news ran beneath larger headlines, but anyone who had followed labor's long battles paused at the note. He was 64. The obituaries reviewed the outline tenement beginnings, rise through trucking and garment corridors, the invention of paper unions, the alliance that helped a national leader climb, the attack that blinded a columnist and hung over his name, the perjury conviction, the fraud cases, the years in and out of federal institutions, the final decline. Reporters called old adversaries for comment. Some gave a version of, "No tears here." Others offered a line about inevitability. A few who had used his services but would never say so out loud read the story, folded the page, and went back to work. The columnist who had refused to be silenced wrote again. He reminded readers that power had once pooled in back rooms, where a man like the one now gone could tilt an industry on a whisper. He warned that such power never disappears entirely. It adapts. Reformers quoted statutes and audits, pointing to cleaner books and rules that discouraged the tricks that had once passed as clever. A handful of businessmen who remembered smooth deliveries and sudden calm used neutral words like efficiency and left out the rest. In union halls, stalwarts took the chance to say that the old order had faded and that members now called their own shots. The truth lived, as always, somewhere inside the overlap of those claims. He never left a memoir or a taped confession that solved the puzzles of his career. The record remains a mixture of courtroom transcripts, investigative reports, newspaper clippings, and anecdotes that contradict one another in predictable ways. The simplest through line is also the most mundane. When deadlines rule, someone will learn to sell time. He learned it early, scaled it with paperwork that counted as people, shifted to corporate shells when unions became harder to bend, and stayed in business until law, age, and health closed the last door. Whether you call that entrepreneurship in a rough market or exploitation dressed up as service, depends on where you stood when the clock threatened to beat you. He left behind a city that had already started to forget names and remember only methods. Paper locals stayed in the vocabulary as a warning. Factoring firms tightened rules because schemes had taught them to. Federal offices kept playbooks built from his cases and used them on successors who had thought the system too old to keep track. In coffee shops where a few veterans still talked about his steadiness, the main topic was not his elegance but the odd comfort he gave people in panic. They would say he could lower a voice and clear a path in a room that felt like it was closing. They would also say that the bill for that calm often arrived later, with interest. Both statements were true, and the city, practical as ever, could hold them at once. What ended with him was not the appetite for shortcuts. That appetite is part of the place, born anew every morning, when trucks queue and orders stack up. What ended was a specific style, the disciplined hush, the reliance on charters and proxies, the turn from fists to filings as the preferred tools of pressure. In his last season, he walked under a sky that had watched him move from one world to another, from loading docks to courtrooms to medical wards. He kept his manners. He kept his secrets. He kept his pace as long as he could. Then the pace left him, and the city kept moving, as it always does, folding his story into its larger memory of how work gets done when the clock is merciless and someone offers, for a price, to make it a little kinder. In the years after he was gone, his name stayed active in rooms where schedules mattered. People still told stories about how he could take a day that looked doomed and make it run on time. They rarely used the words that prosecutors used. They said he had a steady way of talking, that he knew who to call, that when two sides glared at each other over a clipboard, he could make both step back and breathe. The same tales carried a second note, softer but insistent, that his calm had a cost, and that the price wasn't written on any bill of lading. Both parts of the memory traveled together because both were true in different lights, and the city, practical to its core, could hold those truths without strain. The official record, the one you can read in case files and archived papers, lays out a straighter line. He was born into crowded blocks, where work spilled into hallways and news moved by word of mouth. As a young man, he learned where favors were traded, and where paperwork created more leverage than a shove. He built influence in the trucking lanes that fed the garment corridor, and in the union halls that decided who lifted what, when. He specialized in turning signatures into clout. The locals he helped plant were sometimes shorthanded, sometimes barely real. But on paper they held votes that counted at conventions. He used that math to help a rising Teamsters star collect the hands needed to win, and for that triumph he earned a chapter in labor history, and a long tale of scrutiny that never let go. When a columnist who wrote about labor rackets was attacked on a midtown street, the shock changed the city's posture. The victim refused to quit and kept writing. The police and prosecutors widened their net. The name that kept returning to their desks was his. Indictments reached him. Conspiracy charges tried to thread him into the plot, and grand juries heard hours of testimony about phone calls, cash, and whispered meetings. He fought those accusations and beat the most explosive count tied directly to the assault. Yet the stain of that episode clung to his public identity and colored every courtroom he entered afterward. It didn't matter that a verdict had gone his way on the headline accusation. Memory outlives verdicts, and in that memory, he became the quiet center of a larger fear. Televised hearings dragged the underworld of labor corruption into daylight. The committee, chaired by a senator from Arkansas, turned courtroom ritual into a national broadcast. A young counsel, named Robert F. Kennedy, pressed questions with a persistence that made viewers lean in. On that stage, he invoked his rights like a metronome, steady, unflinching. The image fixed him in the country's mind as the man who built influence from documents and discipline, not noise. After the cameras, lawmakers wrote a statute to push light into corners that had thrived in shade. The Landrum-Griffin Act forced disclosures, barred felons from union office for years, and tightened the rules around trusteeships and elections. The law did not bear his name, but its aim lined up with his methods like rails converging. He adjusted. He always adjusted. He put other names in front of him. Proxies took titles, friends signed charters, allies chaired meetings. He stood back and coached. He taught them the timing that had been his advantage from the start. When to call for a vote, when to table, when to let a grievance cool, when to remind a foreman that a late delivery can sink a season. He insisted that official minutes stay tidy and that his advice remain unwritten. To supporters, that looked like mentorship. To investigators, it looked like control from the shadows, especially when officers aligned with his preferences across multiple locals and shops. Contempt citations landed when he refused grand jury questions. Fines followed, short stints for defying subpoenas, added lines to a record already crowded. He found himself more often in a different kind of case, one that didn't turn on tone or hints but on numbers, shipping records, and ledgers. Businesses rose fast on pumped-up inventories and easy credit, pulled in stock, converted goods to cash on the side, and then collapsed into court, leaving suppliers with IOUs and empty racks. Trustees traced shipments, matched invoices to boxes that never reached the listed buyers, and called it a plan rather than a mistake. In those matters, he appeared as the architect who recruited nominal officers, set up lines, calmed labor disputes long enough to finish the cycle, and then receded as the company died on paper. He said he tried to rescue firms. Multiple juries concluded that he had orchestrated collapses. Verdicts sent him back inside for long stretches, and appellate rulings trimmed here and there but left the core findings in place. From a distance, these outcomes looked like chapters turning. Up close, they felt like the same day repeated with slight variations. A summons, a table with microphones, a statement about the weather, a motion to suppress, a ruling, a verdict, a ride back in a marshal's van, a calendar set with appeal deadlines. He never raged in public. He wasn't built for spectacle. He trusted instruments, not improvisations. That core belief made him dangerous in an industry built on deadlines and arguments, and kept him composed when the same industry fed his cases to courts. If you ask why he lasted as long as he did, the answer is simple. He understood that in a city where time is money, control of timing becomes its own business. He sold predictability. That product came wrapped in fear for some, in relief for others. Owners who had been burned by sudden work stoppages or mysterious delays paid to avoid repeats. Stewards who didn't want their crews blamed for every hitch accepted his mediating role because he could walk a complaint from the floor to the office without ego. Dispatchers who lived by the minute took his calls because they knew he would never ask for something that couldn't be done. Each of those small transactions looked benign by itself. Woven together, they formed the web that kept him central to a trade, even when the law tried to ban him from any official role. The garment corridor that shaped him lost mass as cutting and sewing moved first to the outer boroughs, then to other states and beyond. What remained were sample rooms, showrooms, and a pipeline of time-sensitive work that lived by the hour. He shifted with it. He learned airport warehouses the way he had once learned loading docks on 38th Street. He memorized which ramps backed up at dawn, which union halls could calm a flare-up with a phone call, and which owners needed a quick adjustment to cover a holiday rush. He kept fees modest enough to look like consulting, steep enough to signal worth. When critics called that a shake, he called it insurance. The argument never found a neutral referee, because it depended on feeling as much as fact. His link to a crime family never looked like the movie version. He wasn't a showman. He worked in rooms with no corners, where discussions turned on what could be done by lunch, not on oaths. The men who ran that world valued results with minimal fuss. He provided them. As leadership changed, first a transition after an old boss died, then another after a brief reign upended by drug cases, then a quiet hand who preferred to glide rather than stomp, he kept sliding into the same seat. Coordinator, fixer, planner. He didn't send messages with broken things. He sent them with schedules that ran smooth, or suddenly didn't. That was enough in a city calibrated to the minute. He never wrote a defense of his life. He didn't try to frame a legacy, but the documents he left behind by force of law transcripts, financial disclosures he couldn't avoid, appeals that spelled out claims in clear language tell you what he believed. He said he was a specialist in calm. He said he coached rather than commanded. He said that collapses pinned on him were desperate attempts to save jobs that failed in a brittle economy. He acknowledged nothing beyond what verdicts demanded, and treated those verdicts as prices paid rather than morals learned. That posture frustrated reformers who wanted condemnation of old practices and infuriated victims who wanted an apology in print. He stayed himself, all the way down. The people he crossed had names that stayed off the page. Small factories that folded after a rescue that wasn't. Suppliers who chased receivables that would never arrive. Families that watched savings evaporate when businesses they trusted cratered. Those losses gave fuel to prosecutors and gave shape to the argument that his calm masked predation. The same period produced employers who whispered thanks to a man who had steered them away from ruin by untangling a shop floor fight in an hour. Each side pointed to a different set of facts, and both could bring witnesses with papers to back their lines. That is why his story pulls people towards certainty and then slides away. It lives where documents and human feelings rub against each other and leave heat. By the time his health failed in federal custody, the methods he had popularized had already drawn countermeasures. The reporting requirements embedded in labor law forced financial transparency that made sham locals harder to hide. Trusteeships watched benefit funds. Election rules reduced the odds that a stack of charters with light membership could swing a national outcome. Credit markets toughened. Factors demanded proof for every claim. Warehouses kept better counts. The paper tricks that had slid through cracks hit friction. Later generations who tried the same moves found that auditors arrived early and stayed late, and that investigators saw patterns faster because they had studied his cases like pilot charts. Years after, hearings in other eras borrowed vocabulary born in his. Phantom locals, stuck as a label. Bust-outs entered common speech for any enterprise that ballooned and fell by design. The idea that a consultant with the right connections could turn a tense dispute into a manageable timeline kept its pull, even when people knew the hazards. Human nature doesn't change because a law is passed. Workers still need fair treatment. Owners still fear disruption. Those realities build a market for middlemen. What changes is whether the cost of hiring one outweighs the risk he brings with him. His life is a study of that calculus across decades. He rarely spoke about the men who chased him from file to file. He framed their work as part of the job, never personal. They did not grant him the same neutrality. To many of them, he wasn't just another figure to process. He was the case that taught their office how to think. Young prosecutors cut their teeth on his filings, learned to draft clearer indictments because defense counsel had picked apart earlier ones, and carried those sharpened tools into other matters. Agents refined affidavit practices because defense lawyers had taught judges where the seams were. He helped professionalize the people who opposed him by forcing them to improve to beat him. That kind of legacy doesn't fit neatly on a plaque, but it stays. Some memories are small and human. A seamstress who never met him remembered that after a blow-up was settled, the boss let everyone go home an hour early and brought in pastry the next day, a gesture that turned nerves into a story to laugh at later. A driver the same age as his grandson recalled a word from a supervisor that made a disputed run rotate fairly the next week. Those aren't endorsements of a saint. They're notes from people who felt the ripple effects of a man who understood the value of pace. On the flip side, a wholesaler kept a framed invoice from the month his cash flow collapsed and used it as a warning when anyone floated an easy fix. He would tap the frame and say that nothing is free. Whatever sympathy you bring to his tale runs up against the brute list in his record. Perjury under oath about links he didn't want on paper. Fraud that a series of juries found in plans that looked too neat to be bad luck. Conspiracy counts that knitted together conversations, shipments, and cash. Contempt for refusing to answer questions in a system that expects answers. Bans on union office that he worked around with layers, then wore more penalties when those layers looked thin to a judge. Tax questions that return because cash without invoices looks like fog to an auditor and invites pursuit. He absorbed each hit with equanimity and gave almost nothing back in public. That stoicism made him seem impenetrable to some and robotic to others. It was neither. It was practice. He outlived some of the era's largest personalities and outlasted others by seeming smaller in public than the legends made him. That choice kept him out of certain traps. It did not keep him out of prison. It did not protect him from illness. It did not save him from becoming a symbol for whatever a reader wants to criticize or admire in the city's appetite for shortcuts. That symbolic weight is part of why his name endures. It lets people argue about a past that still influences a present shaped by deadlines and bottlenecks and the friction between duty and survival. His death closed a file but not a conversation. Reporters wrote tidy summations, listed dates, pulled quotes from prosecutors and union reformers, and moved on to the next story. Inside smaller circles, people told longer versions. A retired foreman would say that he had kept a plant running through a hard winter by scoring a last-minute driver allocation after one call. An agent would say that every time he saw that small smile on the courthouse steps, he doubled his efforts on the next case. A union Democrat would say that members deserved to choose their leaders without ghosts in the room, and that his presence made that harder. Each of those people was right from where they stood. What remains is a map of how power moved along city blocks where trucks, votes, and signatures met. He learned to read that map early. He never stopped reading it, even when the cartography changed and the symbols shifted. He learned to hide inside normal business. And he learned that the best hiding place draws light over time because nothing stays secret when schedules and money are at stake. His endurance came not from avoiding heat, but from accepting it as the price of doing the work he chose, and then doing that work without drama. Eventually, the combined weight of law and age ended his run. That is how most long careers end, whether they begin in boardrooms or at loading docks. If there is a lesson for people who never step into a union hall or a distribution center, it may be this. Institutions matter, and so do the habits of those who use them. Paper can build or hide. A vote can elevate a reformer or empower a fixer. A signature can lock in or trick. When the system rewards clarity, people like him have less room. When red tape replaces honest oversight, people like him thrive in the clutter. The years that followed came with better oversight in some places and renewed confusion in others. His influence shows up in both outcomes in the rules, designed to prevent the tricks he used, and in the rituals that survive because they serve human needs that never fade. You could end the story at the medical ward, where his last days went quiet, but that would miss the orbit of his life. Better to end it in motion, the way his days always ran. Picture a driver backing a truck to a loading dock at dawn, a foreman clutching a clipboard, a steward checking a clock, an owner doing math about penalties for a missed shipment, and a phone that can still make the difference between order and setback. That phone either rings or it doesn't. When it doesn't ring, people solve their problems without interference. When it does, someone like the man who is gone steps into the space between sides and sells time. He made a fortune and built a criminal record doing that in a particular city at a particular moment. That moment passed, and the city changed, but the human problem he exploited and soothed stayed the same. That is why his name lingers. It marks an era when charters could be tools, when a no-show position could be a lever, when a whispered warning about a schedule could carry more force than a shouted threat. It also marks the transition to a time when daylight and paperwork made those maneuvers less viable. His story is not a romance, and not a sermon. It is a record of how a boy from crowded blocks turned urgency into currency, how he rode that talent through fame, scandal, courts, cells, and hospital rooms. And how, after he was gone, the city kept moving while the rules learned from his choices settled into place. People still race deadlines. People still look for shortcuts. They always will. The difference is that the paths he used now have signs posted, built from the lessons he forced the city to learn. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Johnny Dio here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through discipline, strategy, and silent influence. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch, but haven't subscribed yet, so if you enjoyed this story, your support truly helps us keep bringing these powerful tales to life. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.